Thank you. It's a pleasure to be sharing with you some remarks about the benefits of peer interaction. What I'm going to tell you, I wrote that first in my book about 20 years ago, which was translated 10 years ago, as you can see, in Chinese. And in order to put it in a context, I'd like to start with when I started teaching at Harvard University about 30 years ago. When I started teaching, I based my approach on my intuition. I started doing what my teachers had done, to lecture, very much like the professor who is shown in this picture. I was a popular lecturer. My students liked me as an instructor, and they did well on the test. So I thought I was a very good teacher. For many years, I continued to teach this way, by direct instruction. And it's only after about 7 years that I discovered that while my students were able to pass the test, they were not really learning. They were not really internalizing what I wanted them to learn. And we want our children, we want our students to learn, not just pass the test. So I started to reflect on my teaching, and I realized that I was mostly focusing in the classroom on transferring information, very much like I'm doing now here with you. But education is so much more than the transfer of information. Yes, transfer of information is important, but in the 21st century, we have many ways of transferring information. We have books, we have the internet, we have devices, we have lots of different ways of transferring information. The hard part of learning is not the transfer of information. It's making sense of that information, assimilating the information, internalizing the information. In the standard approach to teaching, what is done in class is, number one, the transfer of information. And then the students are responsible on their own for that second part. But if you stop to think about it, which is the hardest of those two steps? Is the hard part transferring the information, or is the hard part making sense of the information? I think we all agree it's the second part that is the hard part. So as teachers, we should really put the emphasis on the second part, not on the first part. So about 25 years ago, I decided I was going to flip that around. Rather than putting all my effort on the transfer of information and letting the students be responsible for the assimilation of that information, I was going to flip it around. Let's make the students responsible for the transfer of information. We have so many different approaches for that. Books, computers, the internet. And then use the teacher time to help the students make sense of the information, practice the information. Now, the way I did that in my own class, which is very close to what Landi is doing now, was actually by having students interact with each other. I taught not by telling, I taught by questioning. And I had students interact with each other during class time while I'm there to help them. So even if you have a large group of students, the students break up into small groups of 2 or 3 students. What are some of the benefits of this peer interaction? Well, one, Students are actively engaged because you interact with each other. Your mind, your body is engaged in the learning process. Also, students have to commit before they talk to each other. And that gives rise to an emotional investment. You heard Melanie speak about intrinsic motivation to learn. If you look at small children, there were a couple of them out there before I came here, 2-year-old, 3-year-old. They are own the learning. They're intrinsically motivated to learn. As students get older and older, they lose the intrinsic motivation. It gets replaced with an extrinsic motivation. You will learn or you will not pass the test. Well, in a certain sense, it destroys people's energy to learn. The great thing about group learning is it brings that back. Now, you've heard both the CEO, Sean Lee, and Melanie mention the word research. One of the things I have done throughout my career is to look at data. Ultimately, what matters is not what our intuition is. Ultimately, what matters is what research shows works better. So I've always done research to look how much better peer interaction is than direct instruction. One of the things to measure is learning gains. How much do students gain from the peer interaction compared to direct instruction? So I measured the gain during direct instruction, and then when I changed to peer instruction, I measured the gain again. And the gain was 3 times as large. Think about that for a moment. Not 10% more, not 20% more, not 30% more. No, 200% more than with direct instruction. And because of the higher learning gains and because of the bigger emotional investment of students, not only are there these higher learning gains, it sticks. There's better retention because the students not only learn it to pass the test, they learn it for life. Now, over the past 10 years, I've been coming to China quite often, ever since my book was translated. And I've come to the realization that these ideas of group learning are deeply embedded in Chinese culture. Already a few thousand years ago, Confucius said, whenever there are 3 people together, there's bound to be one who knows the answer. You take what is good from one, and you ignore what is poor. So you see, this idea of working together, of teaching each other, is nothing new. It's actually not only in Chinese culture, it's in ancient Greek culture too. Socrates, more or less at the same time as Confucius, said that we should learn by questioning, not by teaching, and we should learn through dialogue. Students should have a dialogue with each other. Now, one important point, and we heard that in Sean's presentation, is diversity. Students of different level helping each other. If all the students are exactly at the same level, it's much harder to teach each other. And you would think, doesn't that just benefit the weaker student at the expense of the better student? The answer is no. Because as every teacher knows, the person who learns the most in any classroom is the teacher himself. So if you permit students to teach other students to interact with each other, the weaker students will learn from the better students, but the better students will learn from the act of teaching. So everybody wins. Everybody gains from this approach. Lastly, we really want to convey knowledge. And it's kind of interesting to pause for a moment at the meaning of the Chinese characters for knowledge, shui wen. To learn by asking questions. So even your word for knowledge embeds the idea of learning through questioning and answering those questions, answering each other's questions. So I want to leave you with this thought, and if you're interested in more information, I'll be happy to stick around. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor.